neighborhood, and I come from a background of working in the areas of anti-poverty and anti-racism work when I lived in other cities, and moved here. And as my son got involved and started school, recognized that he had some special needs, and discovered that because of underfunding, because of the lack of resources in schools, he wasn't going to get the support he needed. So started to advocate for him, discovered that every time I tried to get something more for him, it was taking away from another kid. So the problem was clearly something bigger. So I decided to devote my time to trying to fight to improve funding and resources for all students, to make our schools more inclusive and welcoming places for all students and more of a relevant place for all students. In looking at today's topic, I noticed on the Facebook materials that the forum was a combating apathy forum. And I thought to myself, is apathy really the problem? And I don't think that it is. I don't think the problem is that people are apathetic. I think that the problem is that we've been facing year after year after year of governments at all levels who don't listen to us, who lie to us, who don't respond when we do organize. So it's difficult to keep up that momentum of organizing. But our experience at the school board, whether it's around our budget situation that we had, where we were facing massive cuts, and parents all over the city, students, and just community members at large got together and fought and worked together to try and speak up and fight it back against those cuts. That wasn't a sign of an apathetic population. That was a sign of a population who understood how important public education was to them, how important their schools were to them, how important their music programs, their Aboriginal education programs, their ESL, their special education supports, all of that. People understand that. People that are connected to schools understand that deeply. Then, as was mentioned before, just recently we went through the rounds around the possibility of school closures. It was a heart-wrenching experience. Our community exposed their souls to such an extent. People who had nothing else to give gave details of their personal lives in order to try and show how important our schools are to them, are to their kids. But it was also extraordinarily empowering. While I think it was hell to have put our communities through that, it was also just so extraordinarily empowering for all of us to see how much a neighborhood school means to our community, how much public education means to every parent, to every student in that community. It was not a sign of apathy. It was a sign of people understanding the importance of getting together, uniting, and fighting for what they believe. And our school board listened, responded, and chose A, not to close those schools, but B, also to work with the community to try and figure out ways that we can make those schools more connected to neighborhoods. Find out ways to make our schools more relevant. Through that process, it gave a huge push to our initiatives around Aboriginal education. So we're in the midst of another process now to try and work with the Aboriginal community who've been holding forums, and we've been there to listen, to decide what we could do to make our schools more responsive, more reflective, and answer the needs of the Aboriginal community better than they have ever. And the reality is that the situation now, we fail the Aboriginal community, and there's just no two ways about it. So anything we can do to improve that, I think, is a step ahead. And I know that Chris is going to talk about that more fully, and Noel is going to talk about the impacts of the cuts that we've experienced. In Vancouver, since 2002, $68 million in cuts have happened in the Vancouver school system. that has an impact on every student. That means less supports. It means crowded classrooms. It means, and Noel, I know, will go through the list. So I just quickly want to touch on why that's happened. Why is it that education is so badly underfunded? If you look back in the 1980s, corporations began to realize that their profit levels weren't where they wanted it to be. They were starting to fall. Their real rate of profit was starting to fall. So they started to look at ways that they could improve that, turn that around. They began to put pressure on governments all over the world to cut taxes on corporations, to move funds from the public sphere back into the private sphere by cutting those taxes. That's what's happened in BC in the 2000s. You can look at the percentage of the economy, the GDP that goes into providing public services compared to what it used to be. It's fallen quite dramatically, and that is because of the fact that income taxes to the wealthiest people in our province have dropped, and we're left with less money to spend on public services like health and education. That combines with results in an undermining of people's confidence in public education, an undermining of people's confidence in public health, and also an undermining of people's confidence in the role of government itself. Can government really provide what is needed? And that's an intentional thing. I mean, you can look at all sorts of documents from the Fraser Institute to whoever. That it's not just some sort of conspiracy. It's actually an intentional thing to convince people that government doesn't work, that public education doesn't work, that people should look at a private system, that to force schools into looking at things like vending machines to try and raise enough funds to provide basic necessities in schools. That's all part of a privatization process. So whether it's making the rich people look at private schools as an alternative, or impoverishing public schools so that they have to look at other ways to raise money. That's what's happened in Ontario when they were in the process of doing it. The education minister there was caught on tape saying that they had to manufacture a crisis in education in order to be able to do what they wanted to do. So I think that if you look at it as a whole, you can see that what I was saying at the beginning is true, that the problem isn't apathy. The problem is that there's been an alienation of people from the system. We don't connect with the system, but yet I think that you can look at what's happened at school board in terms of the community's response and getting together to respond to the provincial government's cuts as an example of people taking power on themselves, people fighting back, people getting together and making a difference. And I believe we can win. And you can look at what happened between 2002, 2005 at the Vancouver School Board as an example of how you can win. We were looking at massive cuts to inner city funding. And Noel, I imagine you'll touch on this, so I'll just say it quickly, but we were looking at massive cuts to inner city funding, which would have meant a loss of hot lunch programs and all sorts of supports, extra supports in the inner city. People got together, united, community organizations, teachers, parents. We fought back. We won that. The government reversed those cuts. We won that money back. In 2005, after years of activism by parents, by community members, fighting against horrific education cuts, that year, 2005, which wasn't an election year, but because we had made education funding a major issue, the government for the first time, and you can look at the chart, it's the only year where there's an actual increase in funding. 2005, we actually got to put some money back into the system. It's the only year. Since then, we've had just nothing but years of cuts, but it gives me a sense that together we can work together, we can make a difference, and it's through this kind of community organizing that will happen. Thanks.
Thank you, Jane. And our next speaker is Noel Heron, and Noel is a former school principal, retired principal, and a former Vancouver School Board trustee. And he has been, in case you don't know, has been a tireless advocate on behalf of public schools, in particular inner city schools. Noel.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here this morning. But I first of all want to begin by thanking the community activists and advocates who formed are 18 people on the panel throughout the course of this day. RAN BC, I think, is a remarkable organisation. Scott mentioned it. But when you get a community this intensely involved and is willing to step forward to meet the needs of the community, I think it's a singular achievement. I'll begin by talking about inner city schools, and I want to relate the problem to this particular community. 20 years ago, actually 22 years ago, a group of vice principals and principals got together and put together a principal's position paper on inner city schools. We identified the pressing needs, the emerging needs of this community, and pointed out to the board at the time that we urgently need help. Now, the board at that time and successive school boards, to their credit, regardless of political stripe, supported the document and went ahead and set up, I think was at that time, from our perspective, an exemplary inner city project. I regret to say, since 2001, when the current government took power, in the title of that book, the new book, they are playing fast and loose with public education, and particularly with this community. Let me start number one. The Vancouver School Board this year was compelled to cut the only preschool program in this province. We had it in 3 schools, but down the way in Strathcona, that program was there for 20 years for 4-year-old kids. It began to level the playing field. It was cut. The board didn't have much choice in that. 20 years ago, we had all-day kindergarten. Now the government is announcing all-day kindergarten as if it's something new. For God's sakes, we had it for 20 years, and they still messed it up with a half day. Half the schools throughout this province get all-day kindergarten. Only next September will it begin. So let's start with early childhood education. Preschool for 3 and 4-year-olds, all-day kindergarten for kids. These were 2 foundational aspects of the inner city program. Since 2001, right up to the present, we've seen a steady erosion of support, services and programs for kids in this particular community. In the 5 schools, Strathcona, Seymour, McDonald, Britannia Elementary, Britannia Secondary, and others as well. Cuts to public schooling in an inner city school hit kids in an inner city disproportionately harder. We're talking about kids living in poverty. We're talking about families who are marginalized. And when you start cutting that, the damage is done doubly, if I can put it that way. Start with early childhood education. You see the losses there. But let me tell you one bright spot in this community before I move away from early childhood education. 6 months ago, up the street, I attended the opening of the Hastings Learning Centre, organised, promoted, and funded by this particular community. I'd like to congratulate the people involved from RACAM and the community and the parents who put on that program that started this year for 3 and 4-year-olds. There are 20 kids now getting the advantage of a stimulating early childhood program funded by the community. They asked support from the Ministry of Children and Family Development. And by the way, that's a living, breathing, walking disaster of a ministry, if ever there was. When you cannot give funding to some of the most disadvantaged families and kids in this province, and yet we are in the shadow, I remind you, up the street, we're in the shadow of a $600 million roof for BC Place, and we haven't got $100,000 for early childhood, then there's something seriously wrong in this province. That's but one example. Just set that back to back with a lavish expenditure on the Olympics. I'll not get into that, but when we see social programs urgently needed, disregarded, then we have a problem. But the bright light is the Hastings Learning Centre. And by the way, I do want to mention, when I mentioned those 5